After divorce at 75, I was left penniless. My ex-husband laughed. "Let's see how you survive." But 3 weeks later, a lawyer called me. "Your father died in 1987 and left you 73 million. We've been searching for you for 30 years. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I had been married to Gerald for 52 years. That's longer than most people stay in the same city, longer than most friendships survive, longer than most dreams. 52 years of mornings where I made his coffee, 2 sugars, no cream, and set it on the left side of the table because that was where he always sat. 52 years of holidays, of arguments that ended by Tuesday, of children grown and gone, of grandchildren who called on birthdays. I thought I knew what my life was. I thought I had earned the right to understand it. I was wrong. My name is Margaret Eleanor Whitfield. Everyone called me Peggy. I was 75 years old when Gerald looked across our kitchen table, that same table where I had set his coffee for half a century, and told me he wanted a divorce. He did not look ashamed. He did not look uncertain. He looked, if anything, relieved, as though he had been holding his breath for years and could finally let it go. I remember the October light coming through the window. I remember the sound of a neighbor's dog barking somewhere down the street. I remember my own hands, folded on the table in front of me, and how still they were. That stillness surprised me later, when I thought back on it. I had expected to fall apart. Instead, some part of me simply went quiet, like a room where someone has turned off all the lights. "Peggy," he said, "it's been over for a long time. You know that." Did I know that? I turned the question over in my mind for weeks afterward. There had been distance, yes. There had been years where conversation dried up into schedules and logistics. Who needed the car when the plumber was coming? Whether we should invite the Hendersons for Thanksgiving. But I had called that the natural settling of a long life together. I had called it comfort. I had not called it an ending. The truth came out in pieces, the way truth usually does when someone has been careful to bury it. Gerald had been seeing a woman named Diane Holloway for 11 years. 11 years. She was 61 years old, a widow from Columbus who had met Gerald at a regional insurance conference in 2012. I found this out not from Gerald, but from our daughter, Carol, who had known for 2 years and carried the weight of that secret with a kind of grim practicality that broke my heart more than the betrayal itself. "Mom, I didn't know how to tell you," Carol said, sitting across from me in my kitchen 3 days after Gerald had moved his things to a storage unit and checked into a hotel. "I thought maybe it would just end." I looked at my daughter, 50 years old, tired around the eyes, holding her coffee mug with both hands. And I understood that she had been trying to protect me. I also understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that I had been the last person in my own life to know the truth about it. The warning signs. When I looked back, they were everywhere. The way a crack in a wall is obvious once you know to look for it. The conferences that ran longer than scheduled. The new carefulness about his phone. The way he had stopped being irritated by small things, which I had mistaken for personal growth, but which was simply the contentment of a man who had somewhere better to be. Even the way he had started buying new shirts, nicer ones, better colors, which I had thought was vanity, but which was, of course, something else entirely. What does a woman do when she realizes that the life she thought she was living was a set piece? when she understands that her sense of security was built on a foundation that someone else had quietly been dismantling for over a decade. I sat in that kitchen for a long time after Carol left. The coffee went cold. The neighbor's dog stopped barking. The October light shifted and dimmed. And then Gerald called. He was staying at the Marriott on 5th Street, and his voice had that careful, measured quality of a man who has rehearsed what he is going to say. He told me that he intended to file for divorce in 30 days. He told me that he had already spoken to an attorney. He told me that the house would need to be sold to divide the equity, and that given my age and the modest state of our savings, I would need to think practically about my next steps. I said very little. I asked him if there was anything left to discuss. He said he didn't think so. And then, and this was the moment I have returned to again and again in the years since, he said something that I do not think he intended to be cruel, but that landed in me like a splinter that would fester for weeks. He said, "Peggy, let's be honest. What are you going to do at 75? I mean, what do you actually have?" He did not wait for an answer. He said goodnight and hung up the phone. I sat with that question in the silence of my kitchen. What do you actually have? At the time, I thought I had nothing. I had 52 years of a marriage that had apparently been a partial fiction. I had a house that was about to be sold. I had Carol, who loved me but lived in Cincinnati. I had approximately $40,000 in a savings account and a Social Security check that covered my basic bills if I was very careful. I had no idea, none at all, that 3 weeks later I would have something that would change everything. But that evening, I simply sat in the dark kitchen and felt the particular hollow weight of a woman who has been discarded. And I thought, Gerald is right. I have nothing. I would spend the next few weeks learning exactly how wrong I was. The days after Gerald's phone call had a strange, compressed quality. Each one felt both endless and identical. I woke at the same time every morning, made coffee I didn't taste, sat at the kitchen table where Gerald used to sit, and tried to take stock of my situation with the same methodical calm I had always applied to practical problems. I had learned that approach from my father, Arthur Beaumont, who had been a quietly organized man, the kind of man who kept records, who believed that clarity was a form of dignity. My father. I thought about him often during those first raw weeks. He had died in 1987, when I was 37 and newly moved to Dayton with Gerald, who had just taken a position with Midwest Insurance Group. My father's death had been sudden. A cardiac event, his doctor had called it, which was a clinical way of saying that a vital and particular man had simply stopped between one breath and the next. I had been unable to travel back to Memphis for the service because Carol had just turned 3 and Gerald had said the trip was too much. I had mourned my father from a distance, which was a grief I had never entirely finished. But I am getting ahead of myself. In those November mornings, my father was simply a memory, a steady presence in the background of my thinking, the way certain people remain with you, not as a wound, but as a kind of compass. I made a list. That is what I always do when a situation becomes unmanageable. I sat down with a yellow legal pad and I wrote out exactly what I had and exactly what I was about to lose. Assets. The house, valued at approximately $220,000, from which I would receive half after the mortgage was settled. Roughly $75,000. The savings account, $41,200. Social Security, $1,800 a month. A small pension from the school district, where I had worked as an administrative assistant for 20 years before retiring. Liabilities. None, technically. But also, No health insurance beyond Medicare. No family nearby. A body that was 75 years old and had begun to register that fact in various small but persistent ways. A knee that ached in cold weather, a tiredness that sleep did not entirely fix. I looked at the list for a long time. Could I survive on this? Yes, barely, and with very little margin for anything unexpected. I could find a small apartment, one bedroom, somewhere in Dayton, where I knew the streets and the grocery stores and the route to Carol's favorite diner when she visited. I could live quietly and carefully and with almost no room to breathe. Was that what Gerald had meant when he asked what I had? Was that the life he imagined for me while he drove to Columbus on weekends to see Diane Holloway? I felt something shift inside me. Not grief, exactly. Grief I had already begun to work through in those hollow, early mornings. This was something closer to anger, and I want to be precise about what kind of anger it was. It was not hot or irrational. It was the specific, clarifying anger of a person who realizes they have been underestimated. Gerald had laughed. He had actually laughed when I told him I intended to consult my own attorney. "Your attorney," he repeated, in the tone one might use with a child who has announced they intend to fly a plane. "Peggy, you haven't worked in 15 years. You don't have—" He paused, reconsidered, and then said the thing I have never forgiven him for. "Let's just see how you manage." Let's just see how you manage. I hung up the phone and I sat very still for approximately 45 seconds. Then I picked up the yellow legal pad and I wrote at the top of a new page in capital letters, what I am going to do. The plan, in its first rough form, was straightforward. I would hire a divorce attorney, not the young, inexpensive one Gerald had apparently assumed I would settle for, but a competent one, someone with real experience in asset division for long-term marriages. I would ensure that every shared asset was properly documented. I would not accept the first offer. I would not be managed. I had enough money, barely, to retain decent legal counsel if I was careful about everything else. But there was a second item on my plan, one that I almost did not write down because it seemed, even to me, too small and fragile to commit to paper. My father had been a man of modest but real means, not wealthy, but careful. He had owned property in Memphis. He had invested slowly and consistently over decades. And when he died, suddenly, in 1987, with no wife living and only one daughter who could not easily travel, there had been an estate. I had received some notification at the time, a letter from a Memphis attorney that I had filed away during the chaotic weeks of Carol's infancy and Gerald's new job and the general upheaval of that year. I had dealt with it incompletely. I had assumed, in the vague, unexamined way we assume things we do not wish to investigate, that it had all been resolved. Had it been resolved? I went to the filing cabinet in the second bedroom, the room that had been Gerald's home office and was now simply a room full of his absence, and I began to look. I did not find the letter that day. I found Christmas card lists from 1994, Gerald's old tax returns, a manual for a vacuum cleaner we had replaced in 2003. But I kept looking, because something, call it instinct, call it my father's voice in the back of my head, call it the particular alertness of a woman who has recently discovered she was living inside a lie. Something told me to keep looking. I was 75 years old, newly alone, and about to have the most important month of my life. I did not know that yet, but I kept looking. The attorney's name was Susan Park. She came recommended by a woman named Helen Graves, who had been in my church choir for 20 years and whose own divorce, 8 years prior, had been handled with what Helen called surgical precision and zero sentiment. Helen said those words with evident satisfaction, and I wrote Susan Park's name on my yellow legal pad and called the next morning. Susan was in her late 40s, Korean American, with a manner that was direct without being unkind. She had short hair and reading glasses she wore on a chain, and she listened to me with the kind of focused attention that I had almost forgotten existed. When I finished explaining my situation, the 52 years, the 11-year affair, the phone call, Gerald's comment about seeing how I managed, she said calmly, "He underestimated you. That's going to cost him." I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized was tight. Susan walked me through the basics of Ohio divorce law as it applied to long-term marriages. Gerald's pension, his 401k, the equity in the house, all of it was subject to equitable distribution. The length of the marriage worked in my favor. My lack of independent income in the final years worked in my favor. The affair, while not directly relevant to asset division in Ohio's no-fault framework, would be relevant to any claims about dissipated marital assets. If Gerald had been spending marital money on Diane Holloway, and Susan said with quiet certainty that he almost certainly had been, that was documentable and consequential. "I want you to go home," Susan said, "and gather every financial document you can find. Bank statements, investment accounts, any records of large or unusual expenditures in the last 10 to 12 years. Don't remove anything from the house. Just photograph everything." I nodded. I was already thinking about the filing cabinet. What I had not anticipated was how quickly the news would travel. Carol called that evening, her voice careful and slightly strained, and asked if I had done anything yet about the divorce. I told her I had retained an attorney. There was a pause, and then she said, "Dad called me today. He said you'd gone to see a lawyer." Another pause. "He seemed surprised. Let's just see how you manage." Gerald had not expected me to move quickly. He had expected, I think, the grief and paralysis he believed were appropriate to a woman of my age and circumstances. The fact that I had acted within 2 weeks of his announcement had shifted something in his calculations. I thought about that as I drove home in the cold November dark. The fact that Gerald was already calling Carol meant he was monitoring me through her, using our daughter as a relay station for information about my movements. That was not a new dynamic. Gerald had always preferred to gather information indirectly. But now I could see it clearly, and seeing it clearly changed how I moved. The second thing happened 3 days later. I found the letter. It was not in the filing cabinet. It was in a shoebox on the top shelf of the bedroom closet. A box I had last opened, judging by the dust, sometime in the early 2000s. Inside were old photographs, a birthday card from my mother, a hospital bracelet from when Carol was born, and a letter on the letterhead of a Memphis firm. Beaumont, Greer, and Associates, attorneys at law. The date on the letter was September 14th, 1987, 3 months after my father's death. I sat down on the edge of the bed and read it. It was a formal notification from the estate of Arthur James Beaumont, my father, informing me that I was the sole beneficiary of his estate and requesting that I contact the office to initiate probate proceedings. The letter listed a partial inventory of the estate, a property in Memphis, several investment accounts, and, the phrase that made me read the sentence 3 times, additional assets under administration, the full scope of which will require further accounting. I had received this letter in September of 1987. I had been 37 years old, with a 3-year-old daughter, a husband who had just started a demanding new job, a life that felt full to overflowing. I now dimly remembered, called the number on the letter and spoken to someone, a secretary, I thought, and been told that the process would take time and that they would be in touch. They had apparently not been in touch. Or if they had, the letters had been lost in the moves, the years, the accumulating sediment of a long life. I held the letter for a long time. Then I did what my father had taught me to do. I found a clean page on my legal pad, and I wrote down every detail. Beaumont, Greer and Associates, Memphis, Tennessee, 1987. In the morning, I would search for them, and in the morning, I would find that they were still in business, reorganized, renamed, but continuous. And that when I gave the receptionist my name and my father's name and the date of his death, there was a pause on the line that lasted just long enough to mean something. "Ms. Whitfield," the woman said slowly, "could you please hold for one moment?" I held. I watched the frost on the kitchen window catch the weak November light. That pause, I understood later, was the sound of 38 years of waiting coming to an end. The attorney who came on the line after that pause was named Robert Greer, the son of the original Greer, he explained, who had taken over the practice from his father. His voice was careful in the way that voices become careful when they are managing something significant. He confirmed what the letter had suggested, and then he said something that required me to sit down. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "your father's estate was never fully distributed. There were complications, a series of legal challenges, asset structures that required extended administration, and frankly, difficulty locating you as the sole beneficiary after you moved from Memphis. We made attempts to find you over the years. The estate has continued to be managed in trust. At this point," he paused again, "I want to be precise with you. The current value of your father's estate, including the original property holdings and the growth of the investment accounts over 38 years, is approximately $73 million. I said nothing for several seconds. "Mrs. Whitfield, are you there?" "I'm here," I said. "I'm here." Robert Greer explained the next steps in the careful, methodical way of a man accustomed to delivering extraordinary information to ordinary people. There would be documentation to verify my identity and my relationship to Arthur Beaumont. There would be a formal probate process, simplified by the fact that the estate had been continuously managed and the original will was unambiguous. He estimated the process would take several months, given the size and complexity of the estate. He also said, almost as an afterthought, that there had been a competing claim on the estate in 2019. A distant cousin, a man named Douglas Beaumont, who had challenged the will on the grounds that the sole beneficiary could not be located and was presumed deceased. The challenge had been unsuccessful, but it had added procedural complexity. I wrote down the name, Douglas Beaumont. I did not tell Susan Park about the inheritance yet, not because I distrusted her, but because I wanted to understand what I was dealing with before I introduced it into the divorce proceedings. That instinct, I believe, came from my father. Know what you have before you show your hand. But Gerald found out within the week. I do not know precisely how. Carol, I think, mentioned to Gerald that I seemed less worried than he would have expected, and Gerald, who had always been attuned to shifts in my emotional weather, began to make inquiries. His attorney contacted Susan Park with a request for a full financial disclosure that was more aggressive than the standard timeline required. Gerald himself called me twice, the second time with a particular studied casualness that told me he was fishing for information. I gave him nothing. I said my attorney was handling everything and that I would appreciate if he contacted me only through legal counsel from now on. He did not appreciate that. The confrontation happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Gerald arrived at the house without calling, something he had never done in our marriage, which told me how unsettled he was. He sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, in a voice that was almost gentle, that he had heard I had been making calls to Memphis and that he wanted to know what was going on. I told him that my financial affairs were my own, His manner shifted. Not dramatically. Gerald was never a man given to dramatic displays. But the gentleness left his voice and something harder took its place. He reminded me that the house was jointly owned. He reminded me that any asset I had inherited during the marriage might be considered, depending on the circumstances, marital property. He said that if I was hiding something, his attorney would find it, and the consequences for me would be more complicated than necessary. Was that a threat? Sitting across the kitchen table from a man I had known for 52 years, watching him recalculate my value in real time? Yes, that was a threat. I said, "Gerald, I think you should leave." He left, but at the door he turned and said, "Peggy, I know you. You're out of your depth. Don't make this harder on yourself." I closed the door. I stood in the hallway for a moment and noticed that my hands were completely steady. Then things escalated quickly. Gerald's attorney filed a motion within days, requesting a freeze on any financial transactions pending full disclosure. Gerald also, I later learned, contacted Douglas Beaumont, the cousin who had challenged my father's estate, and the two of them had a phone call that Douglas's own attorney would later describe in deposition as exploratory. What they were exploring was whether a coordinated challenge to my claim on the Beaumont estate, combined with aggressive litigation in the divorce, could be used as leverage to force a settlement. That was not a legal maneuver. That was a pincer movement. Susan Park, when I finally told her everything, was quiet for a moment and then said, "Okay, now I understand why he moved so fast." She was not alarmed. She was, if anything, more focused. She explained that inherited assets, under Ohio law, are typically separate property, not subject to equitable distribution, unless they have been commingled with marital assets. My father's estate had never been touched, never transferred, never in any way made part of Gerald's and my shared financial life. It was mine. As for Douglas Beaumont, Robert Greer was direct. The 2019 challenge had failed. A second challenge, without new evidence, would fail again. It would take time and cost money, but it would fail. I understood all of this, and yet, sitting in my kitchen after Susan left, with the frost returning to the window and the house quiet around me, I felt the weight of what was coming. 75 years old, and I was about to fight on two fronts, a divorce and an estate challenge, against men who were organized, motivated, and had nothing to lose. I gave myself 3 days. I drove to a small motel near Yellow Springs, a place I had stayed with Carol years ago when she was young and we took weekend trips through rural Ohio. And I took my yellow legal pad and my father's letter and 3 paperback novels. And I did not answer Gerald's calls or Douglas's attorney's letters or anyone else's demands for those 3 days. I walked along the creek path in the mornings. I ate soup and bread in the small diner on the main street. I slept 8 hours a night for the first time in weeks. On the 3rd morning, I sat on the motel bed with my legal pad, and I wrote, quietly and precisely, everything I was going to do next. I felt for the first time since the kitchen table in October, like myself again. On the last morning at the motel, I received a phone call from a number I did not recognize. The man on the line identified himself as a representative of Gerald's interests, not his attorney, but someone Gerald had apparently asked to make an informal contact. The word informal did the heavy lifting in that sentence. What this man, who gave his name as Phil Mercer and described himself as a business associate of Gerald's, actually proposed was this: that I consider a private settlement outside of formal court proceedings in which I would receive the house outright and a lump sum of $120,000 in exchange for renouncing any claim to Gerald's pension and 401k, and signing a document confirming that any assets I had personally received through inheritance were not the subject of future disputes. I sat on the edge of the motel bed in the thin November light, and I listened to all of this very carefully. Then I said, "Please tell Gerald to contact me through my attorney." Phil Mercer paused. Then, "Mrs. Whitfield, I want to be honest with you. The estate claim is going to be a long process, a very long process. Contested estates of this size can take 3 to 5 years to resolve, and the legal fees alone—" "Thank you," I said. "Please contact my attorney." I ended the call and I sat for a moment looking at the window, which framed a pale sky above the winter trees. Was I afraid? Yes. A settlement of $120,000 represented more financial security than I had expected a month ago. 3 to 5 years was a real timeline. I was 75 years old, but I also understood exactly what that phone call was. It was not a generous offer. It was a calculation. Gerald, and behind him, almost certainly, Douglas Beaumont, who had everything to gain if I abandoned the estate claim, had looked at my circumstances and decided that fear would be their best leverage. They believed that a 75-year-old woman, recently divorced, financially precarious, would be susceptible to the particular temptation of certainty. They were not entirely wrong about my circumstances, but they were entirely wrong about me. I packed my bag, paid my bill, and drove back to Dayton. On the way, I called Susan Park and told her about Phil Mercer's call. She asked me to write down everything I could remember and said she would look into whether the approach constituted any kind of improper contact. Then I called Robert Greer in Memphis and briefed him as well. He confirmed that Douglas Beaumont had retained new counsel and was, in his words, assembling a position. He said it calmly, the way a chess player describes an opponent's opening. Back in Dayton, I understood that the next phase would be different from the first. The first phase had been shock, and then the gathering of evidence, and then the initial legal moves. This phase would be patience. Gerald and Douglas would watch and wait, believing that time and financial pressure were their allies. They would conserve their energy and trust that my resources would erode. What they did not know was that I had people. This realization came to me gradually over the Thanksgiving week that followed. Helen Graves, who had recommended Susan Park, called to check on me and ended up spending 3 hours at my kitchen table helping me organize my financial documents into binders. Color-coded, tabbed, precise. Helen was 71 years old and had been through her own version of this war, and she had the calm, competent energy of a woman who had rebuilt herself from scratch and remembered every step of it. My neighbor Donna, who was 68 and a retired school teacher, began walking with me every morning at 7, not because I had asked her to, but because she had noticed the lights on in my kitchen and correctly inferred that I was not sleeping well, and she had decided, with the unceremonious practicality of a good neighbor, that walking was useful. We did not always talk about what was happening. Sometimes we just walked, and Carol, who had carried her father's secret for 2 years and bore that guilt with her everywhere, drove down from Cincinnati the Wednesday before Thanksgiving and stayed for 4 days. We cooked together. We watched old movies. We had one difficult conversation late on Thursday evening in which she told me that she was angry at her father and that she was sorry, and I told her the truth, that she was not responsible for what he had done, and that I needed her with me, not prostrated in guilt. She cried. I did not, quite. We finished the wine and went to bed. On Friday afternoon, Carol sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, "Mom, $73 million. Do you understand that?" "I'm beginning to," I said. "You're going to be okay." "I know," I said. And I meant it for the first time without reservation. Gerald called once that weekend. I did not answer. He left no message. Douglas Beaumont's new attorney sent a letter to Robert Greer on Monday, outlining a series of technical challenges to the estate documentation. Robert called to tell me about it and said, in the dry way I had come to appreciate, "He's delaying. He has no new evidence. He's delaying." I wrote that down on my legal pad. He is delaying. He has no new evidence. Then I wrote, "Patience is also a weapon." I was cold and clear and ready. Gerald was watching. Douglas was maneuvering. And I was, very quietly, building the case that would dismantle them both. They came on a Sunday afternoon, 3 days before Christmas. I had not expected Gerald to come in person. His attorney had been handling everything through Susan Park, and I had grown accustomed to the managed distance of legal correspondence. Letters that were careful and cold and technically precise. The directness of him appearing at my front door, with Diane Holloway waiting in the car at the curb, was so startling that I stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking. Gerald looked older than he had in October. There were shadows under his eyes that hadn't been there before, and he was wearing a coat I didn't recognize. A new one, I thought, something Diane had chosen. He held a small paper bag, the kind bakeries used, and he held it out to me with an expression I had not seen from him in years, something that resembled humility. "Peggy," he said, "can we talk?" I stepped back and let him in. Not because I trusted what he was doing. I understood, with an immediate and complete clarity, that this visit was not what it appeared to be, but because I wanted to hear it. I wanted to know what form the manipulation would take. He sat at the kitchen table. I made tea because having something to do with my hands felt important. He set the bakery bag between us. It contained 2 scones I saw, the kind from the bakery near what used to be our church. And he looked around the kitchen with an expression that might have been nostalgia, if I had been inclined to read it that way. "I've been thinking," he said, "about how this has gone, and I don't feel good about it." I said nothing. I poured the tea. "I handled it badly," he continued. "The way I told you. The timing. I think I was not kind." Here was the thing about Gerald. He was not unintelligent, and he was not entirely without self-awareness. He knew how to make an apology sound sincere. He had been doing it for 52 years, and he had learned which notes to strike and which ones to avoid. "I want us to find a way through this that doesn't destroy everything," he said. "I've been talking to—" He paused, and in that pause I watched him decide how much to reveal. "I've spoken to someone about the estate situation. Your father's estate. And I just want you to know that I don't have any interest in making that harder for you." So there it was. He knew. He knew. And he was here to tell me he knew, which was itself a kind of pressure. A demonstration that he had information, that he was inside my situation in ways I might not have realized. "Gerald," I said, "what do you want?" He looked at his tea. "I want us to settle this civilly, without years of litigation, without Carol being caught in the middle. I think if we sat down together—" "With Diane waiting in the car?" He blinked. Then, "She drove me." "I know she drove you. What exactly are you proposing?" And then the mask slipped, just for a moment. Just enough. He leaned forward slightly, and his voice changed, dropping the careful, rueful note and acquiring something sharper. "Peggy, you're 75 years old. The estate case is going to take years. The legal fees on something this size are— I've had someone look into this. They're going to be substantial. What if you walked away from all of this with enough to live comfortably and easily for the rest of your life? A real settlement, real money, and none of the—" "I have real money," I said. "I have my father's estate." "You have a claim," he said, "that you haven't proven yet." I set down my teacup. I looked at the man I had been married to for 52 years, and I felt, with absolute precision, what he was doing. He was not here to apologize. He was here to frighten me, wrapped in the performance of conciliation. He was here to make me feel the weight of uncertainty and time and my own age, to make me feel that a comfortable retreat was better than a difficult victory. He was here, in short, because he was afraid. "Gerald," I said, "I think you should finish your tea and go." Something moved across his face. "Peggy, I'm not settling. I'm not withdrawing any claim. I'm not signing anything that limits my rights to my father's estate. And if Douglas Beaumont has asked you to carry this message, you can tell him that my attorneys will be in contact with his." The name landed. I watched Gerald go very still. He had not known, until that moment, that I knew about the connection between him and Douglas. The slight widening of his eyes, the microsecond of recalibration. I had not imagined it. He stood up. He was not aggressive. Gerald was never physically aggressive. But the remnant of warmth in his manner evaporated entirely, and what replaced it was something colder. "You're making a mistake," he said. "I don't think I am." He left the scones on the table. He walked to the door, and at the door he paused in the same spot he had paused in October, and turned back to look at me. He was trying, I think, to find something to say that would restore his advantage, some final word that would leave me uncertain. He did not find it. He left. I stood in the kitchen and I listened to his car pull away from the curb. Then I sat down and I looked at the 2 scones in the bakery bag, and I thought, he came here with bakery scones and a prepared speech, and the assumption that I would be grateful for the attention. And then I felt it. A small current of genuine fear threading through the clarity. Because Gerald was not a foolish man, and if he had come in person, if he had tolerated the indignity of that performance, it meant that something in their position was under real pressure. That was reassuring, but it also meant they were growing more active, not less. I called Susan Park that evening and told her everything. She listened, asked 2 or 3 focused questions, and then said, "Good. You did exactly right. And Peggy, the fact that he came, that tells us something. We're winning." I wrote that down. We are winning. I believed it. And the fear, rather than weakening me, tightened my resolve to the consistency of iron. The deposition took place on a Wednesday, 3 months after Gerald had appeared at my door with his bakery scones and his performance of regret. It had taken that long because Gerald's attorney had filed 2 motions to delay, both of which the court had denied. Douglas Beaumont's attorney, operating in the Memphis probate court simultaneously, had made 3 separate procedural challenges to the estate documentation, all of which Robert Greer had answered with what he described as patient, systematic refutation. The strategy on their side was transparently dilatory. Every delay cost me legal fees. Every additional month was a month in which they hoped my resolve or my resources might crack. Neither cracked. The conference room at Susan's office was spare and well lit, with a long table and chairs, and a court reporter at one end with her equipment. Gerald arrived with his attorney, a man named Craig Whitmore, who was in his 50s and had the practiced authority of someone who had sat at many such tables. Douglas Beaumont did not attend. He was present by phone, his voice occasionally audible through a speaker at one end of the table, his attorney's eyes occasionally moving to the phone in a way that told me they had discussed strategy in advance. I sat across the table from Gerald. He looked, I thought, genuinely tired. Not the theatrical tiredness of October, not the performance of October's bakery visit, but the real tiredness of a man who had been managing a complicated situation for months and had discovered that it was not resolving the way he had planned. Diane Holloway was not present. She had never been present in any of the formal proceedings, which I took as evidence that Gerald had at least enough remaining judgment to keep her out of this particular room. Susan Park sat beside me with a folder of documents, very still and entirely calm. The deposition began with Gerald. Susan asked her questions with the unhurried precision I had come to rely on. Each question placing one more weight on a scale that had been tipping, slowly but consistently, against Gerald for months. The financial records were the architecture of the case. Gerald's 401k statements showing an account balance that had grown substantially during the years of the affair. His credit card records, subpoenaed at Susan's request, showing regular expenditures in Columbus that corresponded to documented visits to Diane Holloway, hotel charges, restaurant receipts, 2 jewelry purchases in 2018, marital assets spent on another woman during a marriage that he had represented to me as fundamentally intact until the moment he decided otherwise. Gerald's answers were careful at first. Whitmore objected at intervals, standard procedure, nothing Susan had not anticipated. But as the questions moved deeper into the financial timeline, I watched something happen that I had not expected. Gerald began to lose the thread. Not dramatically, not in the way it happens in films, where a witness breaks down under pressure. It was subtler than that. He started to give answers that didn't quite align with previous answers. He corrected himself twice. He said, "I don't recall 11 times in 40 minutes, which Susan noted aloud with a quiet precision that made Whitmore shift in his chair. Then Susan introduced the communication records. She had subpoenaed Gerald's email records as part of discovery, a request that Whitmore had challenged and lost. Among those records was a thread between Gerald and Douglas Beaumont, a thread that began, significantly, in November, shortly after I had retained Robert Greer, and that documented, in Gerald's own words, a coordinated strategy. If the estate claim could be contested long enough to exhaust my resources, and if the divorce settlement could be structured to limit my access to interim funds, I would be in a position where accepting a reduced settlement was not a choice, but a necessity. "She doesn't have the stamina for a long fight," Gerald had written in an email dated November 23rd. "We just have to make it long enough." Susan read that sentence aloud. She did not comment on it. She simply read it. I looked at Gerald across the table. I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment. I did not feel triumph. Not yet. I felt something more like sorrow, the particular sorrow of confirmation, of having a suspicion ratified in full. He had never believed I could do this. He had looked at 75 years of living and seen only limitation, and he had bet on it, and he had put that bet in writing. And now it was on a conference room table in the cold January light. The phone speaker at the end of the table crackled. Douglas Beaumont's voice. "I think we should take a break." Whitmore agreed. We took a break. In the hallway, Susan turned to me with a look I had not seen from her before. Not the steady professional calm, but something warmer. "He wrote it down," she said. "He actually wrote it down." "I know," I said. "He thought it was strategy, it's evidence." When we returned to the table, the dynamic had shifted in a way that everyone in the room could feel. Whitmore was more circumspect. Gerald was quieter. The phone at the end of the table was silent. Douglas Beaumont had apparently muted himself, possibly on instruction from his own attorney. Susan spent the next hour walking through the financial documentation with the methodical thoroughness of someone who had nothing to hide and knew it. The total value of marital assets Gerald had proposed to exclude from division. The dissipation of marital funds, a legal term for marital money spent on the affair, which she calculated at over $40,000 across 11 years. The 401k that Gerald had transferred in a move his own attorney had authorized. to an account in his sole name 3 days after announcing the divorce. A transfer that, under Ohio law, was precisely the kind of action that courts viewed with significant disapproval. Gerald's composure, which had held for the first hour, was gone by the end. He was not loud. He was never loud. But he was pale and contained in the way of a man who has understood, finally, the full nature of what he walked into. "Is that all?" he said at the end, to no one in particular. "For today," Susan said. I gathered my coat and my bag. I looked at Gerald one last time. The table between us, the court reporter shutting down her equipment, the pale January light through the windows. "What do you actually have?" he had asked me in October. I thought, more than you counted on. The divorce settlement was reached in February, 6 weeks after the deposition. Gerald did not want to go to trial. Craig Whitmore had advised against it. The emails, the financial records, the documented dissipation of marital assets, the 401k transfer made 3 days into the proceedings. The case Susan had assembled was not merely adequate, it was comprehensive. The settlement gave me the house in full. Gerald's pension was split 60-40 in my favor, reflecting both the length of the marriage and the court's adverse view of the asset transfer. His 401k, valued at approximately $340,000, was divided equally. The $40,000 in documented marital dissipation was added to my portion. I was awarded legal fees. Gerald moved into a rental in Columbus, near Diane Holloway's apartment. He signed the papers on a Tuesday, and that was the end of 52 years. I did not feel what I had expected to feel. I had anticipated something dramatic, relief, vindication. What I felt was quieter, a settling, like a building that has been under stress for months and finally finds its footing. I sat in the kitchen, drank coffee, looked out at the winter yard and thought, it's done. The estate proceedings moved quickly after that. Douglas Beaumont's position, already purely technical, collapsed entirely without Gerald's litigation as ongoing pressure. Robert Greer filed the final documentation in March. I flew to Memphis for the first time in nearly 40 years. I had not expected the city to move me, but flying in over the Mississippi on a gray March morning, seeing the familiar flatness of the land, something opened in me that I had not known was closed. I walked through the neighborhood where I had grown up, past the church, past the elementary school, past the small park where my father had taken me on Sunday afternoons. The hearing itself was brief. The documentation was in order. The challenge had been withdrawn. $73,412,000. Robert Greer shook my hand in the courthouse hallway. "Your father would be glad," he said. He had wanted me to have it. He had put it in writing in 1982, 5 years before he died. Every cent to Peggy, his girl, because she would know what to do with it. He had trusted me with it across decades and distance and all the things that happen in a life. Back in Dayton, I called Carol. She cried. I did too this time. Douglas Beaumont attempted one final challenge in April. It was denied in 48 hours. I read the notification over breakfast, opened the window to let in the April air, cut grass, something flowering on the street, and thought about what to do with the rest of my life. I was 75 years old. I had a house, I had a daughter, I had my father's estate and 52 years of experience with being underestimated. I had, it turned out, quite a lot. The first thing I did was take Carol to Memphis. We flew down in May, when the gardens were in full color, and I showed her the neighborhood where I had grown up, the park, the church, the house her grandfather had owned. We stood on the front porch, and I told her about Arthur Beaumont. The real version, not the abbreviated figure who had existed at the edge of her childhood as a name and a photograph. She held my hand and said, I wish I had known him. He would have loved you, I said, and I believed it entirely. In June, I established a trust. A third went to philanthropy, education, and women's economic independence. The rest was split between long-term investment and liquid funds, ready to be lived with. I established a scholarship at my Memphis high school in my father's name, the Arthur James Beaumont Scholarship for first-generation college students. I stood at the podium and was not, for once in my adult life, tentative about taking up space. I bought an apartment in Cincinnati to be near Carol. I kept the Dayton house. Helen and I traveled, Savannah, New Mexico, then Portugal in the fall. We walked a great deal, sat in cafes, and talked across long afternoons with the freedom of women who have survived considerable difficulty and arrived somewhere on the other side of it. I was 76 years old on the Tagus River at dusk, thinking about my father and about what it means to receive something that has been waiting for you for 38 years. Now, Gerald. He and Diane had moved in together in Columbus. By July, it was strained. She had known him as a man with ease and a full wallet. She was discovering him diminished. By October, they had separated. Carol mentioned it carefully, watching my face. I told her I was sorry, and I meant it, not with sympathy for what he had done, but with the unsentimental sorrow of someone who watched a person choose something smaller than what they had. Douglas Beaumont had been ordered to pay a portion of the estate's legal fees. He was contesting it. It would not go well for him. In December, I sat around Carol's dinner table in the warm light, her husband, her children, the whole living result of all the years, and felt something simple and complete. I was 76 years old. I had more mornings than I could count. I intended to use every one of them. What do you actually have? Gerald had asked. Everything, I thought. Everything I need, and then some. My father waited 38 years to give me what was mine. Gerald waited 52 years to show me who he truly was. Both, in the end, kept their promises. What I learned: a woman is never out of options until she decides she is. Patience and clarity are not passive. They are the sharpest tools available. And the people who tell you that you have nothing are almost always the ones who are afraid of what you might do with everything. What would you have done in that kitchen when the phone went quiet? I'd love to know. Leave a comment, and thank you, truly, for listening to my story. My son texted, "Sorry, but you're not invited for Christmas. You'll celebrate alone." Go away. I silently smiled and left and made a call. 3 days later, my son called me in panic. 22 missed calls. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to think that the holidays were the one thing that could never be taken from you. My name is Margaret Holloway. Most people who love me call me Peggy. And for 68 years, I believed that family was the one investment that always paid dividends. My late husband Harold would have laughed at that, the way I put everything in accounting terms. Peggy, he'd say, leaning back in his armchair with that slow smile of his. Not everything has a balance sheet. Maybe he was right. But then again, Harold never lived long enough to see what our son became. I raised Danny in a yellow house on Birchwood Lane in Fairfield, Connecticut. 3 bedrooms, a porch that needed painting every 5 years, and a backyard where Harold built a tire swing that outlasted our marriage by 12 years. I worked as a senior bookkeeper for Caldwell and Associates for over 2 decades. And when Harold passed from a heart attack in 2011, I managed the estate, settled the debts, and kept the house. All on my own. I was not a woman who fell apart. I was a woman who made lists. Danny was our only child, and I poured everything into him. College tuition, paid in full. His first car, a used Honda Civic, but reliable. His wedding to Christine Patterson in 2007, I contributed $40,000 because Christine's parents offered nothing and Danny looked at me with those eyes, Harold's eyes, and I couldn't say no. I told myself it was love. Looking back, I wonder if it was the first transaction in a very long series. Christine was beautiful in the way that certain flowers are beautiful. Bright, attention-commanding, and quick to wilt if not constantly tended to. She worked as a real estate agent, which suited her. She had a talent for showing people exactly what they wanted to see and hiding everything else. In the early years, I told myself I simply needed to get to know her better. We were different women. That was fine. Not every daughter-in-law becomes a friend. The first cracks appeared so slowly I almost missed them. It started with the Christmas of 2019. I had spent weeks preparing a glazed ham, my mother's recipe for sweet potato casserole, a hand-knitted sweater for little Oliver, who was 6, and a porcelain tea set for Zoe, who had just turned 3 and already loved pretending to host parties. I arrived at Danny and Christine's home in Westport, a 4-bedroom colonial they'd bought with, among other contributions, a $50,000 loan from me that had quietly stopped being repaid. And Christine met me at the door with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We're doing things a little differently this year," she said. Differently meant that the dinner was catered. Differently meant that my sweet potato casserole sat untouched on the kitchen counter because Christine had decided the family was going lighter on carbs. Differently meant that Oliver opened his sweater, looked to his mother before reacting, and then set it carefully aside without putting it on. He was 6 years old and already reading his mother's face like a weather report. I smiled. I ate. I drove home alone on the I-95 and told myself it was one dinner, but the pattern continued. Phone calls that went to voicemail, invitations to Oliver's birthday that arrived after the party had already happened. "We sent it to the old email, Mom. So sorry." Christmases that became shorter, then shorter still, until I was allotted 2 hours on December 26th, the day after, when the real celebration was already over. Christine always had a reason, always a scheduling conflict, a prior commitment, a sensible explanation wrapped in polite language that left no room to argue without sounding unreasonable. By 2022, I had given Danny and Christine a total of $93,000. I had kept a ledger. I am a bookkeeper, after all. $40,000 for the wedding, $50,000 toward the house, $3,000 for Danny's dental work when he was between jobs. I kept it not to demand repayment. I kept it because Harold always said, "Write down what matters, so you don't forget what's real." In November of 2023, Danny called to discuss Christmas plans. I assumed we were finally getting back to something normal. Oliver was 10 now. Zoe was 7. The children were old enough to have real memories of their grandmother. I started planning. I bought gifts. I ordered a spiral-cut ham. Then, 3 days before Christmas, a text message appeared on my phone. It was from Danny. But I could hear Christine's voice in every word. "Mom, I'm sorry, but you're not invited to Christmas this year. You'll be celebrating alone. Please don't come." I read it twice, then a third time. I set my phone down on the kitchen table, the same table where I'd helped Danny with his homework for 12 years, and I looked out the window at the snow falling on Birchwood Lane. Then I smiled, and I picked up the phone. Not to call Danny back, I called Richard Byrne, my attorney. That night, I did not cry. I want to be honest about that. Not because crying would have been weakness, but because there simply wasn't room for tears yet. The hurt was too large to fit through something as small as tears. Instead, I did what I have always done, when the world stops making sense. I sat down at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, and I started writing. At the top of the page, I wrote one word: inventory. Because that's what this was, I realized. Not a personal catastrophe, an inventory problem. I had been investing in a relationship that had been quietly liquidating me for years, and I had been so busy trying to keep the account open that I hadn't noticed how much had already been withdrawn. $93,000. I wrote it out in longhand. $93,000. The way Harold used to say you should write out large numbers when you needed to feel their weight. Then I wrote what I had received in return. A daughter-in-law who treated my presence at family events as a scheduling inconvenience. A son who had learned to forward Christine's decisions as if they were his own. 2 grandchildren I was being systematically separated from. And a text message on the 22nd of December telling me that Christmas was no longer mine. The fear came later, around midnight, when the house got very quiet. It was a specific kind of fear, the kind that only people of a certain age understand. Not fear of Christine exactly. Fear of irrelevance? Fear that I had already become a figure in the background of my own family's life, the woman who sent checks and was thanked briefly and forgotten until the next need arose. Fear that if I did nothing, the next 10 years would look exactly like the last 3, except that Oliver and Zoe would grow up believing that Grandma Peggy was simply someone who existed at a distance, who occasionally sent birthday cards and could be managed with polite, brief phone calls. That fear lasted about 40 minutes. Then something shifted. I thought about my mother, Eleanor, who raised 3 children alone after my father left in 1963. She used to say, "The moment you accept that something is too hard to change is the moment it becomes permanent." My mother was not a soft woman. She was a practical one. And she raised me to understand the difference between mourning and strategizing. I poured myself a cup of tea, chamomile, Harold's prescription for difficult evenings, and I sat back down at the table. The legal pad now had 2 columns. On the left, what I had given. On the right, what had been taken beyond the money. And what had been taken, I realized as I wrote, was access. Access to my grandchildren, access to family occasions, access to the ordinary moments, school plays, Sunday dinners, the small, unremarkable afternoons that accumulate over years into the substance of a relationship. Christine had been conducting a slow, quiet campaign to make me peripheral, and Danny, whether out of conflict avoidance or genuine complicity, had let her. The question was not whether I was angry. I was. The question was what I was going to do with that anger. Whether I was going to let it make me reactive, which would only give Christine ammunition, or whether I was going to let it make me methodical, which was the one thing she would not expect from a 68-year-old woman who baked ham and knitted sweaters. I turned to a fresh page. First, I needed to understand my legal position. I had made significant financial contributions to Danny and Christine's life together. Some of those funds had been framed as gifts, but some had been accompanied by verbal agreements. The $50,000 for the house, specifically, had come with a clear understanding, stated in front of Danny's friend Marcus Webb, who had been present that evening, that it would be repaid within 7 years. 7 years had passed in 2023. Not a dollar had come back. Second, I needed to document the pattern of exclusion, not for emotional reasons, but for practical ones. Connecticut has grandparent visitation statutes. I had looked them up once, years ago after a difficult Christmas, and then told myself I was being dramatic and closed the browser. I was done telling myself I was being dramatic. Third, I needed to stop being the person who absorbed the damage quietly. Every time I had smiled through a slight, I had taught Christine that the slight was acceptable. I had been, in accounting terms, subsidizing bad behavior. I called Richard Byrne the following morning at 8:15. Richard had handled Harold's estate and had known our family for 20 years. I told him, plainly and without excessive emotion, what had happened over the past several years and what I intended to explore. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Peggy, I think you should come in. Bring your records." I already had them. That afternoon, I went to my filing cabinet, the gray metal one in the spare bedroom that Christine had once suggested I replace with something more aesthetic. And I pulled out the folder I had labeled years ago, simply family. Receipts, bank transfer records, the birthday cards with dates. A note in Harold's handwriting from 2009 that mentioned Danny's request for money for the down payment. I had everything. Sitting at Richard's desk 2 days later, I watched him read through the documents. His expression didn't change much. Lawyers are trained for that. But at one point he looked up and said, "You kept all of this?" "I'm a bookkeeper," I said. "I keep everything." He nodded slowly. "Good," he said. "That's very good, Peggy." Outside his window, the snow was still falling. Christmas had come and gone without me. Danny had not called. Christine had not called. There were no messages from the grandchildren. The silence was so complete it had its own texture. But I wasn't grieving anymore. I was planning. The first official document was filed on January the 6th, a Tuesday, in the Fairfield County Superior Court. Richard had spent nearly 2 weeks reviewing everything I'd brought him. The transfer records, the bank statements, the correspondence, a timeline I had reconstructed from my personal calendar going back to 2017. His conclusion was careful, but clear. I had grounds to pursue civil action for the recovery of the $50,000 house contribution, based on the verbal loan agreement witnessed by Marcus Webb, who had already agreed, when Richard contacted him, to provide a written statement. Additionally, Connecticut General Statutes Section 46B-59 allowed grandparents to petition for visitation rights when a relationship with a grandchild had been unreasonably denied and when it was in the child's best interest. We were not filing that petition yet, but we were preparing it. Quietly. The first document was simply a formal demand letter, sent by certified mail to Daniel and Christine Holloway at their Westport address, stating that the sum of $50,000 loaned in June of 2016 and verbally agreed to be repaid by June of 2023 remained outstanding and was hereby formally requested within 30 days. I remember standing at the post office on Post Road and handing the envelope to the clerk. My hands were steady. That surprised me a little. I did not tell Danny the letter was coming. I did not warn Christine. I simply sent it, and then I went home and made myself lunch. Grilled cheese and tomato soup, Harold's favorite. And I sat at the kitchen table and allowed myself, for the first time in weeks, to feel something close to calm. The call came 4 days later. Not from Danny, from Christine. She called my cell phone at 10 in the morning on a Saturday, and I let it ring twice before answering, which was exactly 1 ring longer than I would have in the old days. A small thing, but deliberate. Margaret. She never called me Peggy. It had always been Margaret, the full formal version, which created the impression of respect while actually maintaining distance. "We received something from an attorney's office." "I know," I said. "I sent it." A beat of silence. I could hear her recalibrating in real time. "I think there's been some misunderstanding," she said. "Danny and I always intended to—" "The letter explains the terms and the timeline," I said. "Richard Byrne's number is on the letterhead if you'd like to discuss it further with him directly." "This is not—" She stopped, started again. "This is a very aggressive way to approach a family matter." It's a standard legal remedy for an outstanding debt, I said. I hope you have a good day, Christine. I ended the call. I sat for a moment in the quiet of the kitchen. My heart was beating a little faster than usual, not from fear, from the unaccustomed sensation of having done exactly what I intended to do without apologizing for it. 2 days later, Doris Kaminsky called me. Doris had been my closest friend since we met in a watercolor class in 2014 after Harold passed. She was 71, sharp as a letter opener, and had been watching my situation with Danny and Christine for years with an expression she reserved for things she found both troubling and unsurprising. I heard from Linda Marsh, she said, who heard from her daughter, who works in the same real estate office as Christine. Apparently, Christine has been telling colleagues that you're going through something and that the family is handling it sensitively. I wrote that down. Not because it was legally significant, because it was a data point. Christine was already managing the narrative. But then Doris said something that shifted everything. Linda's daughter, her name is Amber, she's been at the firm about 2 years. She mentioned that Christine has been discussing your finances at work. Not broadly, but enough. She apparently told a colleague that you had set aside funds for Oliver and Zoe's education, and that these funds would naturally become the family's to manage once, and Amber said she was quoting Christine directly, once the situation was resolved. I set down my pen. Once the situation was resolved. What situation? I was 68 and in good health. I had a house, a retirement account, and a carefully maintained portfolio that Harold and I had built over 40 years. I had no serious illness. I had no intention of requiring care, unless Christine was anticipating a situation that hadn't happened yet, or planning to create one. I called Richard back that afternoon. I told him what Doris had told me. He was quiet for a longer moment than usual. Peggy, he said carefully, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it seriously. Has Danny or Christine, at any point in the last year, raised the topic of your estate planning, your will, power of attorney? I thought about it. And then I remembered a conversation at Thanksgiving 2 years ago, when Christine had mentioned, very casually, over the clearing of plates, that she'd read an article about the benefits of families having updated estate documents. She had looked at me when she said it. I had changed the subject. Yes, I said. Once. I want you to review your current will, Richard said, and I want to talk to you about making some changes that clarify your intentions, sooner rather than later. I drove home from that phone call through the cold January streets of Fairfield, past the hardware store and the church where Danny had been baptized, and the library where I had taken him every Saturday until he was 12 years old. The town looked the same as it always had. But something had changed in my understanding of it. This was no longer simply a family disagreement about Christmas dinner. This was about my home, my savings, my grandchildren, my future. And Christine had been planning longer than I had. The second part of the plan required a different kind of courage. Not the quiet, administrative courage of filing paperwork, but the face-to-face kind. I had asked Richard to take 2 parallel steps. The first was to continue pressing the demand letter. The 30-day response window was now running, and Danny and Christine had retained their own attorney, a man named Philip Voss, who had sent a letter describing my $50,000 contribution as a gift made without expectation of repayment, consistent with the established pattern of parental generosity. I had expected this. Richard had expected it too. That's why we had Marcus Webb. The second step was more delicate. I had reached out to Oliver's school, Jefferson Elementary in Westport, to inquire, as his enrolled emergency contact, which I had been since 2014, about my ability to attend his upcoming winter concert. I had not asked Danny or Christine. I had simply confirmed with the school office that my name remained on file and that I was welcome as a family member to attend public school events. I arrived at Jefferson Elementary on the evening of January 22nd with a small bouquet of sunflowers. Oliver's favorite, I knew, because he had told me so himself in a letter he wrote at summer camp 3 years ago, a letter I had kept. I found a seat near the back. The auditorium was warm and smelled like industrial cleaner and someone's takeout coffee, and the children were filing in from stage left in their holiday concert outfits. I saw Oliver almost immediately. He was in the second row, wearing a white button-down shirt that was slightly too short in the sleeves because boys that age grow so fast, and he was scanning the audience with the particular hopefulness that children have before a performance. When he saw me, his face opened like a window. He waved. A real wave, enthusiastic, the kind children stop doing when they get too self-conscious. I waved back. I did not see Christine's face in that moment, but I heard about it later. She and Danny had been seated 4 rows ahead of me. According to Doris, who heard from Amber, who had been told by a mutual acquaintance who'd also attended, Christine had turned white when she spotted me. She said something to Danny in a low voice. Danny turned around, found me in the crowd, and looked. And this is the detail I keep returning to. Confused. Not angry. Confused. As if my presence at his son's school concert was something he genuinely couldn't locate in any category of expectation. They did not approach me during the event, but in the parking lot afterward, as I was walking to my car with my sunflowers and the small glow of having watched Oliver play recorder beautifully in the back row, Christine stepped in front of me. She was wearing a camel coat, and her expression had the particular compression of a person who has decided to be furious in a controlled way. "What are you doing here?" she said. "Watching my grandson's concert," I said. "He played very well." "You were not invited. School events are open to family members on the emergency contact list," I said. I checked. Danny appeared at her shoulder. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "Mom?" he said, and his voice had a quality I hadn't heard in it for years. Uncertainty. Christine cut over him. "This is harassment." "Attending a school concert is not harassment," I said. "I believe your attorney can confirm that." She took a step closer. Her voice dropped to the register she reserved, I imagined, for negotiations that weren't going her way. "You need to understand something, Margaret. We have discussed your behavior with the children's pediatrician. We are building a record. If you continue with this legal nonsense and showing up where you're not wanted, we will pursue a restraining order, and we will use it to make sure you never see those children again. That is not a threat. That is a fact." The cold air between us had gone very still. I looked at her for a moment, at the bright, controlled fury in her face, at Danny standing slightly behind her with his hands in his pockets, looking at the pavement. Then I said, quite calmly, "Thank you for letting me know what you're planning, Christine. I'll pass that along to Richard." I walked to my car. I drove home. I poured myself a glass of red wine, something I almost never did, and I sat in Harold's armchair by the window. My hands were shaking slightly. I want to be honest about that too. Christine's words, "You will never see those children again," had landed somewhere deep in the place where all the real fear lives. Because she might try. She was capable of trying. But she had also, in her anger, made a significant mistake. She had announced her next move out loud in a public parking lot, in front of at least 3 other families who were also walking to their cars. And she had implied that they were already manufacturing documentation against me, which meant, and Richard confirmed this when I called him the next morning, that they were worried. People who are winning don't announce their weapons in parking lots. I gave myself 4 days. 4 days of Doris's cooking and long walks along the Ash Creek, and 2 evenings of old movies that Harold and I used to watch. I let the adrenaline settle. I let the fear pass through me, as my mother always said, like weather. Then I went back to work. The offer came through Danny, which told me everything I needed to know about it. He called on a Wednesday morning, 10 days after the parking lot encounter, and his voice had the careful, rehearsed quality of someone reading from notes they'd been handed. He said that Christine had been reflecting on the situation, and that they both recognized things had gotten out of hand. He said, and I could hear the exact phrase Christine had given him, that they were open to finding a path forward that worked for everyone. He paused. I let the pause sit. "What does that mean, Danny?" I said. He cleared his throat. "Christine thinks, we think, that maybe we should meet for coffee, the 3 of us. Talk things through, like adults. And the demand letter?" A shorter pause. "She thinks that can be part of the conversation." "The demand letter is a legal matter," I said. "It's being handled through Richard's office. I'm not in a position to discuss it informally." "Mom?" His voice shifted then, and for a moment, just a moment, I heard my son underneath Christine's script. "Don't you want to fix this?" It was a good question, and it deserved an honest answer. "I want a relationship with you and with my grandchildren that is honest, and that doesn't require me to pretend that the last several years didn't happen," I said. "If that's what's on the table, I'm interested. But I'm not going to drop a legitimate legal claim in exchange for being allowed back into the holiday schedule. That's not fixing something. That's me paying again." Silence. "I'll let Christine know," he said finally. I stood at my kitchen window after I hung up and watched a pair of cardinals at my feeder, the red one and the brown one, the male and the female, which Harold used to say was the perfect metaphor for every marriage. And I thought about the specific mathematics of what Christine was offering. The implied deal was this: withdraw the legal claim, accept an informal apology, return to the previous arrangement. Which would mean that the last 4 months had been an expensive lesson in what happens when I cause trouble, and that the correct response was to stop causing trouble. That was not a deal I was going to make. But I would be dishonest if I said I wasn't tempted, not by Christine's offer, but by the version of it that Danny's voice had briefly suggested. The version where everything went back to the way it was, where I drove to Westport on Christmas morning and handed out gifts and sat at their table and felt for a few hours like I belonged there. I missed my son, not the man who forwarded Christine's decisions as if they were his own. My son. The boy from Birchwood Lane who had called me from college on Sunday evenings and talked for an hour about nothing important. I held that grief for a few minutes. Then I let it pass. The social support I found, as it turned out, was both more organized and more moving than I had expected. Doris had, without telling me, done something quietly brilliant. She had mentioned my situation, in careful, non-identifying terms, to the women in our watercolor class, 3 of whom turned out to have their own versions of the same story. Elaine, who was 73, had spent 4 years being systematically excluded from her grandchildren's lives by a son-in-law who controlled access. Ruth, who was 66, had given her daughter and son-in-law her mother's antique furniture and had watched it sold at an estate sale 2 years later. Carol, who was 70, had been taken off her late husband's investment accounts through a power of attorney that she still wasn't sure she'd fully understood when she signed it. We met at Doris's house on a Thursday evening, the 5 of us, with tea and shortbread, and a frankness that I found both painful and immensely steadying. These were not bitter women. They were practical ones who had learned, as I was learning, that love without documentation is a liability. "The thing that Christine is counting on," Elaine said, leaning forward with her cup, "is that you care too much to go all the way. That's what they always count on. That we'll stop before the finish line because we don't want to be the kind of mothers who take their children to court." "Are you going all the way?" Ruth asked me. I thought about Oliver's wave in that school auditorium. I thought about Zoe, who I hadn't held since Easter of the previous year. "Yes," I said, "I am." Carol nodded slowly. "Then let's talk about what else you can do." Over the next hour, they shared contacts, strategies, experiences. Elaine had a granddaughter who was now 19 and had sought her out on her own. "They grow up," she said simply. Ruth's situation had been settled through mediation, and she gave me her mediator's name as an alternative option if court became too costly. Carol had connected with a Fairfield County support group for grandparents navigating visitation disputes, and she gave me the coordinator's number. I drove home that night through quiet suburban streets feeling, for the first time in months, that I was not an isolated woman making unreasonable demands. I was one member of a very large, very invisible group of women who had been patient for too long. My patience was over. They came to Birchwood Lane on a Saturday morning in early February, without calling ahead. I was in the kitchen with my second cup of coffee and the crossword when I heard the car in the driveway. The particular sound of Danny's Volvo, which had a slightly loose heat shield that produced a faint rattle on cold mornings. I recognized it before I reached the window. They were both dressed as if they'd made an effort. Danny in the navy wool coat I'd given him 3 Christmases ago. Christine in a dark blazer, her hair neatly arranged. Oliver and Zoe were not with them. That registered immediately. They had come without the children, which meant this was not a reconciliation visit. This was a meeting. I opened the door before they knocked. "Danny, Christine." I stepped back to let them in, because turning family away at the door is not who I am, even now. "I don't have much time this morning, but come in." Christine's eyes moved around the kitchen, registering, cataloging, in the way that real estate agents assess a space. Then she smiled, warm, practiced, and about 3 degrees too wide to be sincere. "Peggy," she said, using the nickname for the first time I could remember, "we've been so worried about you." I poured them coffee without being asked, kept my hands busy, kept my face calm. We sat at the table where I had done Danny's homework with him for 12 years, and Christine arranged herself with the posture of someone who has prepared for a conversation. Danny sat next to her and looked at the table with the air of a man who has agreed to be somewhere without fully agreeing to what might happen there. "We should have come sooner," Christine began. "This whole situation, the letter, the attorney. I think there was a fundamental misunderstanding. The money, Margaret, the 50,000. Danny and I never saw that as a loan. You were so generous. We both understood it as your gift to us, to the family. We never would have accepted it otherwise." "Marcus Webb was in the room when Harold and I discussed the terms," I said. Christine's smile stayed in place. "Marcus, bless him. He's 81 years old, Peggy. I don't think a court is going to put a great deal of weight on the memory of an 81-year-old man." I noted, without showing that I noted it, that she had just dismissed a witness. In front of a former bookkeeper who was keeping track of everything. "I hear you," I said. "I'll let Richard know your position." Danny looked up then. "Mom, can we put the lawyers aside for a second? This is tearing the family apart." His voice was genuine in a way that hurt. "I know things have been hard. I know Christine and I haven't always gotten it right. But Zoe cried last week because she didn't get to see you at Christmas. She's 7 years old, and she cried. The Zoe detail landed precisely where it was intended to land. I took a slow sip of coffee. I'd like very much to see Zoe, I said. I've been asking to see both children for months. And that can happen, Christine said smoothly, picking up his thread with the coordination of a practice team. As soon as we resolve this misunderstanding, you withdraw the legal claim, we work out a schedule, real, regular access, holidays, birthdays, and we move forward. Everybody wins. There it was, the offer again, dressed up this time in Zoe's tears. What happens to the claim if I don't withdraw it? I asked. Christine's expression shifted, just slightly. The warmth dialed down 1 degree. Well, she said, it becomes adversarial. And when things become adversarial, they become unpredictable. Courts look at the whole picture. The children's stability, their school routines, the stress of contested visitation on young kids. Judges take that seriously. She paused. It would be a shame for Oliver and Zoe to have to feel like they were caught in the middle. Let me be clear about what she had just done. She had sat in my kitchen, in the house where I raised her husband, and she had suggested, wrapped in reasonable, regretful language, that she would use the children as leverage if I continued to pursue my legal rights. I set my coffee cup down. I understand what you're describing, I said. I want you both to understand something in return. I am not doing this because I am angry, or because I am going through something, or because I have misunderstood the nature of our arrangement. I am doing this because I have documentation of a pattern that I allowed to continue for too long, because I was afraid of exactly this conversation. Christine's face had gone still. I love my son, I continued. I love my grandchildren. That is why I am not withdrawing. Because what I am protecting is not $50,000. What I am protecting is my right to be a real presence in those children's lives. Not a figure who can be managed and excluded at your discretion. A grandmother. And if it takes a court to establish that, then that is what it will take. Danny opened his mouth. Christine put her hand on his arm. I think, she said, and her voice had lost its warmth entirely now, that you are making a very serious mistake. I've made notes of this conversation, I said. Date, time, who was present. Richard will have it this afternoon. They left 7 minutes later. Danny paused at the door and looked back at me with an expression I couldn't fully decode. Something between sorrow and apology, and something else. Something more complicated that I didn't have a name for yet. When the Volvo backed out of the driveway, I stood at the kitchen window and breathed. My hands were not quite steady. Christine's phrase, when things become adversarial, they become unpredictable, had done its work. There was fear, real fear. The kind that comes not from a single threat, but from the recognition that the person threatening you is intelligent and organized and has no intention of stopping. But here is what I also knew. Fear, in the right hands, is a compass. It points directly at what matters. I called Richard at noon and told him everything. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, Peggy, I think it's time for the second filing. The grandparent visitation petition was filed on February the 19th. Richard had prepared it meticulously, citing Connecticut General Statute Section 46B-59, documenting the systematic reduction in my contact with Oliver and Zoe from 2019 to the present, including the dated correspondence, the canceled visits, the Christmas exclusion text, and the parking lot confrontation witnessed by at least 4 other adults whose names and contact information I had, because I had spent an afternoon after the school concert quietly introducing myself to 3 of the other parents who had been nearby and explaining briefly and factually what had just occurred. I had also, on Richard's advice, written letters, proper letters with dates sent by certified mail, to Oliver and Zoe for every occasion since Christmas. Birthday cards, Valentine's Day, a note on the first day of February just to say I was thinking of them, not to create a paper trail, because I missed them. But the paper trail existed, regardless of intent. The first court date was set for March the 5th. A preliminary hearing, not a trial, a structured conversation before a family court judge to determine whether mediation was appropriate or whether the matter would proceed to formal proceedings. I dressed carefully that morning. Navy blue, which Harold always said made me look like I meant business. Pearl earrings that had been my mother's. I arrived at the Fairfield County Courthouse with Richard at 8:45, 15 minutes early, because I am a woman who is always 15 minutes early. Danny and Christine arrived at 8:58 with Philip Voss, who was younger than I expected and had the slightly aggressive confidence of an attorney who had never lost in front of a family court judge and had not yet encountered one who disagreed with him. We were assigned to a conference room first. Standard practice in family matters, Richard told me, where the judge's clerk facilitated a preliminary exchange. Christine sat across the table from me in a charcoal blazer, composed and precise. Danny sat beside her. He had not looked at me directly since walking in. Philip Voss opened. The $50,000 contribution was, he stated, a gift. He cited family members who would testify to Peggy's established pattern of generous gifting to the family over many years. He questioned the reliability of Marcus Webb. He suggested that my pursuit of a visitation petition was indicative of a family relationship that had become strained and contentious, and that the source of that strain was, in his framing, my behavior. He was good. I'll give him that. Then Richard presented our documentation, bank transfer records, the verbal loan agreement, and Marcus Webb's written statement, which had been notarized and delivered to the court. Dated correspondence showing the progressive restriction of my access to the grandchildren. The parking lot incident, corroborated by written statements from two of the parents who had witnessed it. And this is the thing I am proudest of, and which cost me nothing except the habit of a lifetime of careful record-keeping. A complete chronological log of every visit with Oliver and Zoe from 2017 to 2023, compared against a calendar of family events from which I had been excluded. When Richard placed that calendar on the table, something changed in the room. Christine's attorney reached for it first. He reviewed it in silence. Then he showed it to Christine. I watched her read it, and I watched the exact moment when she realized the scope of what was in front of her. Not just a dispute about Christmas, but a 7-year documented record of a systematic pattern. "This is not," she began. "Mrs. Holloway," the judge's clerk said firmly, "please let counsel respond." Philip Voss asked for a recess. We took 20 minutes. When we reconvened, there was a new quality to the room. Philip had spoken to Christine, and Christine's composure had a different texture. Tighter, more brittle, the composure of someone controlling something that wanted to come apart. It was during the second session that it happened. Philip Voss, perhaps feeling the ground shifting, tried to reframe the entire narrative. He suggested that my campaign, his word, of legal action and school appearances and certified letters had been psychologically distressing for the grandchildren. That Christine had sought advice from Oliver and Zoe's pediatrician. That there were concerns about my stability. Richard looked at me briefly. I gave him the smallest nod. He produced a single page, a printout of a text message exchange, not between me and anyone, between Christine and Danny, from the December 22nd, when Danny sent me the exclusion text. It had been sent to me by Danny himself 3 weeks earlier. He had not told Christine he'd done it. The exchange read, in part, Danny texting Christine asking, "Are you sure about this?" She's their grandmother. And Christine responding, do it. Send exactly what I wrote. Don't change anything. And then, after the message to me had been sent, good. Now she'll either fall in line or give us the excuse we need. The excuse they needed. For what? Richard answered that question by placing the second document on the table. A printout of a conversation Amber at Christine's real estate office had provided. A conversation in which Christine had told a colleague, in plain language, that Peggy Holloway had significant assets and was not getting any younger, and that if things went as planned, the family would have control of those assets within the year. The room was very quiet. Christine stood up. That is completely taken out of context. Mrs. Holloway, she is lying. That woman has always been... Christine, Danny's voice. She stopped. He was looking at the text message printout. The one where she had written, don't change anything. The one where she had written, give us the excuse we need. Danny, she said sharply, don't... I sent her that printout, he said quietly to the room. The silence that followed was one of the most complete silences I have ever sat inside. Christine turned to look at her husband, and I watched something pass between them that had been building, I suspected, for years. Not love, not hatred. Something more tired than either. My son looked across the table at me. Mom, he said, I'm sorry. The hearing did not end that morning. These things never do. But the ground had shifted so completely that what followed over the next 6 weeks was less a legal battle than a structured unwinding of a position that could no longer hold. Christine retained Philip Voss through the end of the proceedings, but the dynamic had changed. Attorneys read the room, and Philip began filing his documents with a certain distance from his client's instructions. The text message evidence, combined with Amber's formal deposition, created a situation in which Christine's credibility was genuinely compromised. Marcus Webb, 81 years old and sharp as he had ever been, delivered his statement with the confident precision of a man who had spent 40 years in contracting, where a verbal agreement carried exactly the same weight as a written one, if you remembered it clearly. He remembered everything: the color of the kitchen table, what Harold had been drinking, Danny's exact words. We'll pay it back, Marcus. Give us 7 years to get on our feet. A judge found the weight of evidence sufficient to conclude that the $50,000 transfer had been a loan, not a gift. In April, a consent order was entered requiring Daniel and Christine Holloway to repay the $50,000 plus 6 years of applicable interest within 18 months. The total came to $61,200. The grandparent visitation order followed shortly after. The family court judge reviewed the documentation and issued an order providing for regular contact with Oliver and Zoe, 1 weekend per month, alternating major holidays, and 2 weeks in summer. The order noted explicitly that the documented pattern of exclusion had not served the children's best interests, and that ongoing interference with the schedule would constitute contempt of court. Christine's attorney filed 2 objections. Both were denied. But the most significant thing that happened in those 6 weeks did not happen in a courtroom. Danny came to Birchwood Lane alone on a Thursday evening in late March. He called ahead, which was new. We sat at the kitchen table and talked for 3 hours. He told me that Christine had been tracking my finances in ways he hadn't fully understood until he saw the documents in that conference room. He told me the Christmas exclusion had been entirely Christine's decision, and that he had sent the text because she had been standing beside him, and he hadn't known how to refuse. I knew it was wrong the second I hit send, he said. That's why I kept those texts for 3 weeks. Then I thought about what Dad would have said. I looked at my son across Harold's table and thought about how much a person can love someone while also being devastated by them. How both things are true at once, without either canceling out the other. Whatever you decide about your marriage, I said, my relationship with you and the children is separate from it. That's not going to be Christine's decision anymore. On the first weekend in April, Oliver met me at the door and wrapped both arms around me in the fervent way that children hug when they have missed someone and didn't know how to say so. Zoe hung back slightly, then said with great seriousness, "Grandma Peggy, I saved you some of my Halloween candy." It was April. "That is the kindest thing anyone has said to me in months," I told her. The three of us walked to the park. Oliver showed me a card trick. Zoe made me the chief guest at an imaginary tea party, using sticks and bottle caps as props. I sat on a cold park bench in early April sunlight and understood, in the wordless way that some things can only be understood, that this was what I had been fighting for all along. Not the money, not the legal victory, satisfying as it was. A stick, a bottle cap, a child pouring imaginary tea with enormous ceremony. I accepted the cup with both hands. By the time autumn came to Fairfield County, my life had changed in ways I was still occasionally surprised by. The visitation schedule was working. Every third weekend, Oliver and Zoe arrived on Birchwood Lane with overnight bags and the energy of children who know they are going somewhere they are genuinely wanted. Oliver, 12 now and deep in early adolescence, had taken to sitting at the kitchen table after dinner and talking to me about history and a detective novel series he'd discovered. Zoe had claimed Harold's old armchair as hers and spent her visiting hours drawing elaborate maps of imaginary countries with their own capitals and exports. I had resumed watercolor classes. Doris and I walked every Tuesday and Thursday morning along Ash Creek, 3 miles, regardless of weather. In September, I booked a trip to Savannah, somewhere I had always wanted to go and spent decades finding reasons to postpone. I went alone. I walked the squares, ate shrimp and grits, and sat beneath Spanish moss with a book from a shop on Bull Street, feeling the particular lightness of a person who has stopped waiting for permission to take up space in the world. The $61,000 was repaid in full by the following spring in scheduled installments that arrived on time without reminder. As for Christine and Danny, I am not a woman who wishes people ill, but I am a woman who keeps accurate records, and the record of what followed was neither surprising nor, in the deepest part of my honest self, entirely unwelcome. The marriage did not survive the year. Danny told me in November that Christine had asked for a divorce. The counseling had clarified rather than resolved things. Christine relocated to a condo in Stamford. Several Westport acquaintances had been near that courthouse during the proceedings, and this is a small county where information moves efficiently. She did not tell many people what had actually happened. But silence, in such communities, is its own communication. Danny rented an apartment in Fairfield, closer to his job and closer to Birchwood Lane. We had dinners occasionally now, not every week, but regularly enough to feel like a rhythm. He was in therapy. He was slowly, imperfectly, learning to occupy his own opinions. I was cautious with him because I had learned the cost of giving trust on credit. He was earning it back, installment by installment, and that seemed right. I turned 70 in November. Doris brought a cake. Oliver performed a card trick as a birthday entertainment and almost got it right. Zoe gave me a watercolor painting. Bright, wobbly, completely abstract. Made in secret with Doris's help. I framed it and hung it in the kitchen between the window and the photograph of Harold. Looking at it one morning over coffee, I thought, this is what was worth protecting. Not the money, not the judgment, the frame on the wall, the child who made it, the room they know they are welcome in. I had protected it, and it was real. Looking back, the hardest moment wasn't the text message or the parking lot. or the courtroom. It was midnight at my kitchen table, deciding not to accept what I'd been handed. I learned this. Dignity cannot be taken from you, but it can be surrendered quietly, one accommodation at a time, if you stop paying attention. So I ask you, what would you have done? Because you are worth the fight. Never let anyone convince you otherwise. If this story stayed with you, please leave a comment. Share it with someone who needs it. Thank you for listening. Peggy.